The cowboys you grew up watching never existed. The noble sheriff, the quick-draw hero, the honorable outlaw with a code, all of it invented by men who never set foot west of the Mississippi. The real Old West was a place where doctors robbed graves for teeth, where towns elected corpses, where children vanished into mines and were listed simply as expenses. What you're about to hear are 20 facts that were deliberately erased from history, too strange for textbooks, too disturbing for Hollywood, too real to be comfortable. These stories were buried for a reason, and you're about to dig them up. Before we begin, understand this. Everything in this video happened. Every name was real. Every event was documented. These are not campfire legends or tall tales passed between drunken prospectors. These are the official records, the ones that were filed quietly and forgotten deliberately. The Old West had no public relations department. It had survivors and victims, and the survivors rarely told the whole truth. What follows are fragments they left behind. In a small Colorado mining town, a convicted murderer named William Williams was sentenced to hang. The execution proceeded normally. The trapdoor opened. The body dropped. But the rope had been measured incorrectly. Williams hit the ground, neck unbroken, gasping for air. He was still alive. The crowd fell silent. The sheriff hesitated. According to territorial law, a man could not be hanged twice for the same crime. Williams, technically, had served his sentence, but the town had other ideas. They dragged him back up the gallows steps, fitted a new rope, and hanged him again. This time it worked. No court ever acknowledged the second execution. The death certificate lists a single hanging, lasting 2 minutes. Frontier pharmacies sold many questionable remedies. But one ingredient appears repeatedly in territorial medical records: render human fat. Executioners in certain western territories would sell the bodies of hanged criminals to physicians, who would render the fat and mix it into salves for rheumatism, joint pain, and skin ailments. The belief was that the life force of the deceased would transfer healing properties to the living. One Montana druggist advertised a salve containing pure criminal tallow, charging premium prices. Customers rubbed the rendered remains of executed men into their aching joints without hesitation. The practice continued well into the 1880s, ending only when embalming became standard and bodies were no longer available. In an 1879 cattle theft case in Kansas, the prosecution faced a problem. The only witness to the crime was the stolen horse itself. Unable to produce human testimony, the prosecutor made an unusual request. He brought the horse into the courtroom and asked the owner to call its name. When the horse walked directly to the defendant and nuzzled his pocket, where he habitually kept sugar cubes for the animal, the jury took it as identification. The defendant was convicted based partly on the horse's behavior. The case was never appealed. The horse lived another 12 years on the owner's ranch, unaware it had participated in the judicial system. In the summer of 1884, a logging camp in the Oregon Territory experienced something physicians couldn't explain. It started with one man dancing alone outside his cabin. He couldn't stop. Within days, others joined him, not willingly, but compulsively. Their legs moved of their own accord. They danced until their feet bled, until their muscles seized, until they collapsed from exhaustion. 14 men were affected. 2 died from heart failure. The rest eventually recovered, though several reported recurring episodes for years afterward. Camp physicians blamed bad water and moved the settlement. But similar outbreaks had occurred in medieval Europe. The phenomenon called choreomania, how it appeared in an isolated Oregon logging camp, remains unexplained. We're just scratching the surface. The stories ahead grow darker, stranger, more difficult to accept. But every single one is documented fact. When outlaws died without family to claim them, their bodies became property of whoever possessed them. One Colorado undertaker realized dead criminals had commercial value. He developed a preservation technique using arsenic compounds that would mummify corpses indefinitely. He then sold viewing rights to traveling carnivals, which displayed the remains as attractions. The mummified body of one trained robber toured the country for over 60 years, eventually ending up in a California amusement park funhouse. Workers there assumed it was made of wax. When a film crew moved a figure for a shoot, its arm broke off, revealing bone, preserved muscle, and the unmistakable structure of human remains. The outlaw had been hanging in that funhouse for decades, mistaken for a prop. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 250,000 children were shipped west on trains and distributed to families at station stops. The process was called placing out. Children from eastern orphanages were lined up on platforms, and local farmers and townspeople would examine them like livestock. They checked teeth, tested grip strength, looked for signs of disease. Children who appeared strong were chosen for farm labor. Those deemed too weak were returned on the next train. Siblings were routinely separated, never to see each other again. One survivor recalled standing on a Nebraska platform, watching her brother walk away with a stranger, his small hand waving until he disappeared behind the grain elevators. She never learned his fate. Medical knowledge in the frontier was advancing rapidly, and physicians needed specimens. One territorial doctor made arrangements with local law enforcement. Whenever an execution was scheduled, he would attend personally, not as a witness, but as a collector. Within hours of death, he would perform careful craniotomies, removing the brains of executed criminals for study. His collection eventually numbered over 40 specimens, each labeled with a crime committed by its former owner. He believed criminal behavior was visible in brain structure and spent decades trying to prove it. His research was never validated, but his collection survived, eventually donated to a medical school that quietly disposed of specimens in the 1950s without public acknowledgement. Eleanor Dumont arrived in Nevada City in 1854, presenting herself as a sophisticated dealer of vingt-et-un blackjack. She became famous as Madame Mustache, named for the dark hair that grew on her upper lip as she aged. But research revealed she had lived previous lives under different names in different territories. In each location, she had been someone else entirely. Different accents, different histories, different husbands. She would establish herself, accumulate resources, and then vanish completely, only to reappear elsewhere as a new person. When she finally died by suicide in 1879, the investigation revealed at least 3 distinct identities she had maintained simultaneously across hundreds of miles. No one ever determined her true name. Most history books give you heroes and villains. What they don't give you are the people who existed between those categories. The one's too complicated to explain. The next stories are about them. During the westward expansion, newspapers discovered that Indian attack stories sold papers. It didn't matter whether the attacks were real. Editors fabricated entire massacres, complete with detailed casualty lists and survivor testimonies. Illustrations depicted events that never occurred. One Kansas newspaper published 7 different massacre stories in a single year, not one of which could be verified by territorial records. The stories served multiple purposes. They justified military action, encouraged land seizures, and terrified Eastern readers into supporting Western settlement. Some settlements were abandoned based purely on fictional reports of nearby attacks. Families fled homes they had built for years, running from enemies that existed only in newsprint. Isaac Parker, known as the hanging judge, presided over the federal court in Fort Smith, Arkansas. He sentenced 160 men to death. 79 were actually executed, but Parker kept a private record no one was supposed to see. In a personal ledger, he tracked not just the sentences, but his own certainty about each conviction. Next to names, he made small marks, single lines for cases he believed were just double lines for those that troubled him. 17 names had double lines. 17 men he wasn't certain deserved to die. 17 men he hanged anyway, because the system required it. Parker reportedly suffered from nightmares in his final years. He told his wife he saw faces he couldn't identify. She found the ledger after his death and burned it, but not before a courthouse clerk made a copy. Deadwood. South Dakota grew so fast that the living had no time for proper burial of the dead. The original cemetery filled within months, rather than establish new burial grounds outside town, which would require valuable land. Residents simply built over the dead. Saloons, hotels, and storefronts were constructed directly on top of grave sites. The bodies were never moved. Modern archaeological surveys have confirmed what historians long suspected. Significant portions of downtown Deadwood rest on top of human remains. Construction workers still occasionally unearth bones during renovation projects. They quietly report the findings, and work continues. John Chivington was a Methodist minister before he became a military officer. He led the infamous attack on a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho encampment at Sand Creek. Afterward, Chivington's soldiers took scalps, fingers, and other body parts as trophies. But what disturbed even his contemporaries was what came next. Chivington reportedly displayed some of these trophies during a Denver theater performance, holding them up between acts to cheering crowds. When congressional investigations later condemned the massacre, Chivington defended his actions from the pulpit. He never expressed regret. He died of cancer in 1894, still maintaining he had served God's purpose. The line between civilization and savagery in the Old West was never where people pretended it was. Sometimes the savages wore badges. Sometimes they wore crosses. The next stories reveal what happened when no one was watching. When the Donner Party became trapped in Sierra Nevada snows, their descent into cannibalism became infamous. Less well known are the dozens of similar incidents that occurred in mining camps across the West. One Colorado prospecting party, trapped by early snows in 1873, survived for weeks by boiling and consuming their leather equipment. When the leather ran out, they drew lots. The loser was killed and eaten by the others. The survivors eventually walked out of mountains. They told authorities they had survived on rabbits. But one man, delirious with guilt, confessed to a priest. The priest kept the confidence. The secret came out only decades later, when the confessing man's granddaughter discovered his detailed journal hidden in a family trunk. Many famous Old West photographs were complete fabrications. Photographers traveled from town to town, offering to document authentic frontier violence. They would hire locals, provide costumes and props, and stage elaborate scenes, complete with smoke pots and theatrical blood. One photographer created an entire series depicting the last stand of a notorious outlaw. The outlaw was played by a local farmer. The lawmen were played by the farmer's neighbors. The photographs were sold to Eastern newspapers as documentary evidence of Western justice. They still appear in history books today, labeled as authentic. On the frontier, doctors were scarce. In their absence, women often serve as community healers. One New Mexico woman, known only as Tijuana, performed amputations, bullet extractions, and tumor removals using only whiskey and leather straps. Her patients would bite down on roll cloth while she worked. She reportedly completed over 300 major procedures during her career, with a survival rate comparable to trained physicians of the era. Her secret was speed and cleanliness. While Eastern surgeons operated in blood-caked coats, Tijuana boiled her instruments in water mixed with lye. She had no formal training. She couldn't read, but she understood something about infection that would take decades for medical science to confirm. Most outlaws feared the noose. One feared something stranger. A wanted man named Charles Bowles, better known as Black Bart, robbed 28 stagecoaches without firing a single shot. He left poems at crime scenes and always addressed victims politely. When detectives finally identified him through a laundry mark on a drop handkerchief, they didn't need to hunt him down. They simply published his photograph in every newspaper in California. Bowles turned himself in within a week. He reportedly told the arresting officer that he couldn't stand having his face displayed in public. The shame of being known was worse than prison. We've reached the final stories now. These are the ones that should have stayed buried. These are the ones that will follow you after this video ends. In one Nevada mining town, the cemetery was built on unstable ground. Underground water erosion created sinkholes. Over time, coffins began to shift and migrate through the soil. Families would visit graves and find headstones move feet from their original positions. Some coffins rose partially to the surface. Others sank and disappeared entirely. In one documented case, a coffin traveled over 30 feet underground before resurfacing in a neighboring family's plot. The town eventually abandoned the cemetery entirely. Today, the site is an empty field. Beneath the surface, the dead continue their slow, silent migrations. In 1879, A Utah prisoner named Henry Brown escaped territorial jail using the mail system. He convinced a sympathetic guard to crate him in a wooden box and ship him to a Denver address. The journey took 3 days. Brown survived on stored water and hardtack. When the crate was opened by a Confederate in Denver, Brown emerged stiff but free. He was never recaptured. The guard was eventually discovered and imprisoned, but Brown himself vanished into history. Some records suggest he lived another 40 years under an assumed name, dying peacefully in California. He reportedly never entered a post office again. The Comstock lode was one of the richest silver deposits ever discovered, but one particular shaft, known as the Yellow Jacket, became notorious for death. Fires, floods, and cave-ins killed workers with disturbing regularity. Then rumors began circulating about something else. Miners reported hearing voices deep in the tunnels. Voices speaking languages no one recognized. Equipment would vanish. Men would become disoriented and wander into abandoned shafts, never to return. In 1873, a fire in the Yellow Jacket killed 45 miners. The shaft was sealed permanently. When modern researchers proposed reopening for study, local descendants of the original miners organized a formal protest. The shaft remains sealed today. Whatever is down there, real or imagined, will stay buried. Henry Plummer wore a badge in Bannack, Montana. He was elected sheriff on a platform of bringing order to the lawless mining camp. But Plummer had a secret. He led a network of road agents who robbed and murdered travelers on the trails he was sworn to protect. His gang, known as the Innocents, killed over 100 people while Plummer maintained his respectable facade. When vigilantes finally exposed him, they hanged him from a gallows he himself had ordered built for other criminals. Plummer's final words were a request. He asked to be hanged slowly so that death would not come too quickly. No one has ever satisfactorily explained why he made that request. Perhaps he wanted time to reflect. Perhaps he was simply afraid. Or perhaps, after years of living as two different people, he no longer knew which one deserved to die. The Old West never truly ended. It merely changed addresses. The violence became institutional. The exploitation became incorporated. The silence around uncomfortable truths became professional. The frontier closed officially in 1890, when the census declared there was no longer a continuous line of unsettled territory. But the frontier was never really about geography. It was about what humans become when no one is watching, when law is distant, when survival demands choices that civilization pretends don't exist. That frontier still exists. It always will. Here is the question you should carry with you. If the real West was as different from the stories we were told, what else has been hidden? What other parts of history have been polished smooth for our comfort? If you watched until now, the algorithm will reward us both if you subscribe. More stories like these are coming. The buried history of humanity is endless, and we're only beginning to dig.